Every report confirmed it. Every signal reinforced it. What he didn't know was that the retreat was fake. By the time the desert erupted in fire, Germany's most feared commander realized he had walked straight into a trap designed to break him. The German commander was confident. Not hopeful. Not optimistic. Certain. From his perspective, the evidence was overwhelming. American radio traffic spoke of confusion and withdrawal. Supply shortages were openly discussed. Units appeared scattered and demoralized. To German intelligence, it looked like the same army that had collapsed weeks earlier, poorly led, poorly coordinated, and psychologically unprepared for sustained combat. In his personal diary, the assessment was blunt. The Americans had superior equipment, yes, but lacked will, cohesion, and aggressive leadership. One more decisive blow at their center, and the entire Allied position in North Africa would unravel. Eisenhower would be forced to retreat. The British would stand alone again. And history, he believed, would repeat itself. This wasn't arrogance without cause. For 2 years, this commander had outmaneuvered experienced British forces across the desert. He had built a reputation on speed, unpredictability, and relentless pressure. His enemies feared him. His subordinates trusted him. His instincts had been right more often than wrong. And now, in February 1943, everything suggested the Americans were ready to break. The target was Gafsa, a dusty desert town that controlled critical supply routes. Intelligence reports estimated fewer than 3,000 American troops in the area. Defensive positions appeared thin. Reconnaissance showed signs of recent evacuation. Intercepted communications hinted at requests for permission to withdraw. To the German High Command, it looked like opportunity. But confidence can be dangerous when it rests on assumptions. What the German commander did not know, what no one in his headquarters fully grasped, was that the Americans he believed he understood no longer existed. 3 weeks earlier, those assumptions would have been correct. In January 1943, American forces had suffered a humiliating defeat at the Kasserine Pass. Over 6,000 casualties. Units broke under pressure. Equipment was abandoned. Command structures collapsed. Even Allied leadership was shaken. General Eisenhower would later admit that the American soldier had not yet learned to hate the enemy. Morale was shattered. Discipline was inconsistent. The U.S. Army in North Africa looked like a force learning warfare the hard way, and paying for it in blood. Then, on January 23, a new commander arrived. Lieutenant General George S. Patton stepped off the plane in Morocco wearing a custom-tailored uniform, ivory-handled revolvers strapped to his waist, and an expression that one staff officer described as pure certainty. He did not come to comfort defeated troops. He did not offer reassurance. He did not speak of rebuilding confidence slowly. His first message was clear and uncompromising. He told his officers he didn't want to hear about holding positions. Holding was what the enemy did. From now on, the Americans would advance, constantly. Aggression was no longer optional. Discipline would be absolute. Hesitation would not be tolerated. Patton immediately began removing ineffective officers, promoting aggressive junior leaders, and enforcing standards with brutal consistency. Helmets were worn at all times. Saluting was mandatory. Vehicles were kept immaculate. Units trained relentlessly, not in theory, but in the exact type of mobile, armored warfare they would soon face. But discipline was only part of the transformation. Patton understood something deeper. He knew that the Germans were not just studying American capabilities, they were studying American behavior. And behavior, he believed, could be manipulated. In his private notes, Patton wrote that his opponent was predictable in his unpredictability. He would feint, then commit fully where success seemed likely. But he always exploited success too far. That tendency, Patton believed, could be used against him. While American troops trained by day, Patton was shaping perceptions by night. Radio operators were ordered to transmit messages in easily breakable codes, deliberately describing American units as undermanned and disorganized. Requests for withdrawal authorization were broadcast openly. Dummy vehicles were positioned to simulate retreating columns. Even arguments were staged, loudly, within earshot of suspected informants in the local population, complaining about fuel shortages and the inability to mount offensive operations. Everything the Germans were seeing was exactly what they expected to see. And that was the most dangerous part. Because as German confidence grew, American preparations accelerated. Entire divisions began moving under cover of darkness. Tanks were hidden in dry riverbeds. Infantry units repositioned silently. Artillery was emplaced with precision. Radio silence was enforced, except for the carefully crafted lies meant to be intercepted. The Germans believed they were watching an army retreat. In reality, they were watching an army reset. By February 13th, the German commander issued his orders. At dawn the next morning, veteran panzer units would strike Gafsa in a classic blitzkrieg: rapid penetration, encirclement, annihilation. It would be decisive. It would confirm everything he believed about the Americans. That evening, he wrote confidently in his diary, "Tomorrow, we break the American center." What he could not know, what he would not realize until it was far too late, was that while he believed he was hunting a broken enemy, he had already stepped into a trap designed not just to defeat him, but to dismantle his confidence entirely. And when the desert dawned the next morning, the assumptions that had guided 2 years of victory were about to collapse in a matter of hours. When George S. Patton took command, he did not inherit an army. He inherited a problem. The men under his authority had been defeated, publicly, decisively, and recently. Many had survived their first major engagement against German forces only to watch units break, orders conflict, and leadership falter. The loss at Kasserine Pass was not just tactical. It was psychological. Patton understood that before he could fight the Germans, he had to fight doubt. He began by changing the environment. Every visible detail mattered. Uniforms were inspected relentlessly. Equipment was cleaned until it gleamed. Helmets were worn at all times, even far behind the lines. To outsiders, these measures looked cosmetic. To Patton, they were essential. Discipline, he believed, created confidence. Confidence created aggression. Officers who hesitated were removed. Junior commanders who showed initiative were promoted rapidly. Patton wanted leaders who moved first and explained later. Mistakes made at speed could be corrected. Hesitation could not. But discipline alone would not defeat a seasoned German opponent. Patton knew his enemy was studying patterns, especially American ones. The Germans had concluded that American units were slow to react, cautious in commitment, and prone to retreat under pressure. That assessment had been reinforced by recent battles. Patton decided not to challenge that belief. Instead, he fed it. Radio traffic was carefully crafted. Operators transmitted in codes known to be easily broken, describing American units as undermanned and requesting withdrawal authority. Messages complained openly about fuel shortages and delayed resupply. To German intercept units, it sounded like an army on the verge of collapse. At the same time, visible movements reinforced the illusion. Dummy vehicles were positioned to resemble retreating columns. Camps were struck deliberately in view of observers. Even heated arguments were staged, loudly, within earshot of suspected local informants, reinforcing the narrative that American forces lacked both fuel and confidence. Everything was designed to confirm what the Germans already believed. While this theater played out in daylight, the real transformation happened at night. Under cover of darkness, entire American formations began to move. Infantry divisions shifted into blocking positions that would cut off any German advance. Armored units were repositioned into concealed wadis and dry riverbeds, hidden from aerial reconnaissance. Artillery was emplaced with precision, its firing lanes calculated to channel any enemy movement into narrow corridors. More than 25,000 troops, hundreds of tanks, and massive artillery assets were moved without alerting the enemy. Radio silence was absolute, except for the false transmissions meant to be overheard. Patton trusted almost no one with the full plan. He was convinced that intelligence leaks existed even at senior levels. Not even Eisenhower was fully briefed. The risk was enormous. One mistake, one intercepted order, one compromised movement, and the entire American force could be destroyed in detail. When Patton finally presented his plan to his senior officers, the reaction was immediate. 3 formally objected. The operation was too aggressive. The timing was too risky. The Americans, they argued, needed more time. Patton's response was recorded by his aide. "The Germans think they're hunting us. Tomorrow morning, they're going to realize they're the prey." Training intensified in the final days. Not generic drills, but rehearsals for a single scenario, the exact one Patton expected the enemy to attempt. Tank crews practiced coordinated advances. Artillery units drilled rapid-fire missions. Infantry rehearsed movement under fire and immediate exploitation of breakthroughs. Patton spoke to his troops repeatedly. He did not lie to them. He did not promise easy victory. Instead, he attacked the one thing he believed still held them back: doubt. He told them the Germans believed they were cowards. that they would break again, that they were already beaten in the enemy's mind. Then he gave them a promise. In 1 hour of combat, he said, they would teach the Germans the most expensive lesson of their lives. By February 13th, everything was in place. The Germans, watching from afar, saw exactly what they expected to see: an American army pulling back, uncertain and disorganized. Confident in their intelligence, they issued orders for a decisive strike. Veteran panzer divisions would advance at dawn, penetrate the American center, and destroy what remained of U.S. resistance in the region. The plan was classic, aggressive, and familiar. And it was walking directly into a battlefield that had been prepared down to the minute. As night fell across the Tunisian desert, American units lay silent in their concealed positions. Engines were cold. Radios were quiet. Orders had already been given. The transformation was complete. The same soldiers who had broken weeks earlier were now positioned to execute one of the most coordinated American operations of the North African campaign. At dawn, the Germans would attack what they believed was a retreating enemy. What they would find instead was an army that had learned how to think, move, and fight with purpose. And when the first shots were fired, the difference would be unmistakable. Dawn on February 14th arrived cold and clear over the Tunisian desert. At 0530 hours, German reconnaissance units sent back reports that confirmed everything the High Command expected. Gafsa appeared lightly defended. There were signs of recent American withdrawal. Vehicle tracks led west. Defensive positions looked thin and incomplete. To the Germans, it was validation. At 0620 hours, the attack began. 3 German columns surged forward across open terrain, engines roaring, dust rising behind them. This was familiar ground for veteran panzer crews: wide desert, clear visibility, perfect conditions for speed and maneuver. The advance was fast, confident, and aggressive. The German commander was with the lead elements, personally directing what he believed would be a decisive breakthrough. For the first 20 minutes, nothing challenged that belief. Then, at 0645 hours, the desert exploded. From positions the Germans hadn't detected, American artillery opened fire simultaneously from 3 directions. This was not scattered defensive fire. It was precise, coordinated, and overwhelming. Shells crashed into advancing columns, detonating among tightly packed vehicles. Within minutes, dozens of German tanks were burning. Radio operators reported that the barrage was unlike anything they had encountered in the Desert War. It was not meant to stop the advance outright. It was designed to shape it, to funnel German forces into narrower corridors where escape and maneuver would become increasingly difficult. Still, the German commander did not hesitate. Intercepted communications captured his immediate response. Push through. This is desperation fire from broken units. Maintain speed and break their center. From his perspective, the explanation made sense. This had to be a final, panicked defense. The Americans, he believed, were throwing everything they had into one last effort to slow the inevitable. He was wrong. At 0715 hours, the deception collapsed completely. From concealed positions to the south, the American 1st Armored Division surged forward in full force. Nearly 400 tanks emerged at speed, advancing in coordinated waves. This was not a probing attack. It was a deliberate, rehearsed assault aimed directly at the German flank. German tank commanders were stunned. They had been told the Americans could not coordinate armor operations, that their attacks would be hesitant and disjointed. What struck them that morning was something entirely different: fast, synchronized movement controlled as if by a single mind. One German commander later wrote that what they faced was more sophisticated than anything they had encountered from the British. The Americans moved with purpose, exploiting gaps instantly, maintaining pressure without losing cohesion. This was not the army of Kasserine Pass. As the American armored assault slammed into the southern flank, the artillery fire intensified. German units attempting to maneuver found themselves constrained by terrain that had been deliberately selected to limit movement. Every adjustment fed them deeper into the trap. At 0742 hours, reality finally broke through. Intercepted transmissions captured the German commander's realization. We are not fighting retreating Americans. This is a prepared trap. All units, defensive formation, prepare to withdraw. But even this response had been anticipated. The moment German forces attempted to pull back, American infantry units advanced from concealed positions to the north and west. Retreat routes that had appeared open suddenly vanished. British artillery, repositioned quietly in advance, began firing into predetermined zones, sealing off escape. The battlefield became a box. German tanks, designed for rapid maneuver in open desert, found themselves compressed into killing fields. Smoke, fire, and debris reduced visibility. Communications faltered. Unit cohesion collapsed under constant pressure from armor, infantry, and artillery acting in unison. The battle the Germans expected to win in 3 hours stretched into 8 hours of brutal combat. By early afternoon, losses were catastrophic. Tanks were destroyed or abandoned. Crews bailed out under fire. Veteran formations that had once dominated the desert were reduced to fragmented groups fighting simply to survive. American losses were real and significant. Tanks burned. Men were wounded and killed. But the psychological balance of the battle was unmistakable. This was no longer an engagement between equals. By 1400 hours, the outcome was clear. Nearly 90 German tanks were destroyed or captured. Over 2,000 casualties had been sustained. Entire units were combat ineffective. More devastating than the material losses was the destruction of certainty, the belief that American forces could be predicted, manipulated, and easily broken. In the German command post that afternoon, silence followed the reports. The commander who had built his reputation on intuition and speed now faced a battlefield that made no sense through the lens of his previous experience. The Americans had not simply resisted. They had anticipated him, step by step. And for the first time in North Africa, he understood that the enemy in front of him was no longer learning how to fight. They already knew. The deception that had guided his decisions was gone. In its place was a realization far more dangerous than defeat. The Americans had found their confidence. And worse, they had found a commander who knew exactly how to use it. By late afternoon, the battlefield had fallen quiet, not because the fighting had ended, but because it had fragmented. Smoke hung over the desert in thick columns. Burnt-out tanks marked the advance routes like gravestones. German units that had once moved with precision were now scattered, their formations broken, their commanders struggling to re-establish control. Inside the German command post, reports arrived in pieces. Radio operators spoke in clipped phrases. Tank losses were higher than expected. Artillery positions had been neutralized. Movement corridors identified that morning were now under constant fire. Every attempt to regroup was met with immediate resistance. For the first time, the German commander stopped issuing rapid, aggressive orders. He listened. What he heard was unfamiliar. Subordinate officers were no longer asking for permission to advance. They were asking how to escape. This shift mattered more than any destroyed tank. The German doctrine that had brought victory across Europe depended on momentum. Speed created confidence. Confidence broke the enemy. But now momentum was gone. The Americans had not only halted the advance, they had reversed its psychological direction. The commander ordered a limited withdrawal to reorganize. It failed. American armored patrols probed relentlessly, denying the Germans the space they needed to regroup. Artillery followed every movement. Even at night, flares and sudden barrages shattered any sense of safety. The desert, once a place of maneuver, had become a prison. Intercepted German communications that evening revealed the depth of the shock. Officers who had fought for years without hesitation now questioned intelligence reports, command assumptions, and even their own judgment. The certainty that had defined previous campaigns was gone. Meanwhile, Patton did not relax his pressure. He understood that victory in this phase was psychological, not territorial. His orders emphasized harassment, rapid exploitation, and constant contact. No pauses. No breathing room. Every German attempt to stabilize had to be disrupted before it could take shape. American units rotated forward continuously. Tank crews who had been exhausted hours earlier were replaced by fresh elements. Infantry advanced cautiously but relentlessly, securing high ground and forcing the Germans to react rather than plan. This was not chaos. It was control. The contrast between the two commands became stark. On the German side, decisions slowed. Orders were debated, revised, and sometimes ignored as units struggled to survive. On the American side, tempo increased. Orders were shorter. Execution was faster. Confidence replaced hesitation. Late that night, a German staff officer recorded a line that would later appear in post-war analysis. The Americans fight now like veterans. The realization was devastating. For years, German commanders had viewed American forces as technically capable but psychologically fragile, dangerous only when supported by superior numbers or overwhelming firepower. What they faced now was something else entirely, an enemy that could deceive, anticipate, and exploit with precision. And at the center of that transformation was Patton. He did not need to be on the front line to be felt. His influence was in the rhythm of operations, the refusal to pause, the relentless demand for initiative. Every movement reflected his belief that hesitation was more dangerous than risk. By the morning of February 15th, German forces had fallen back across a wide front. Defensive positions were established in haste, often without coordination. Supplies were short. Fuel was critically low. Morale had dropped sharply, especially among units that had been assured of an easy victory. American reconnaissance units confirmed what Patton already suspected. The enemy was no longer dictating the battle. They were reacting to it. At headquarters, Patton reviewed casualty reports with a grim expression. Losses had been significant. Men had died. Tanks had burned. This was no clean triumph. But the numbers told a story that mattered more than territory gained or lost. The German advance had been broken. More importantly, the myth surrounding it had been shattered. The belief that American forces could be intimidated, predicted, and outmaneuvered was gone. In its place stood an army that had proven it could think, adapt, and strike with intent. That night, Patton sent a brief message to Eisenhower. "The enemy has lost the initiative. We will not give it back." It was not a boast. It was a warning. Because Patton understood what came next. An enemy who realizes they have been outthought is more dangerous than one who believes they are winning. The Germans would adapt. They would regroup. And they would not make the same mistake twice. But the balance of the campaign had already shifted. The Americans had crossed a line, from learning how to fight to knowing how to win. And for the German command, the realization was unavoidable. They were no longer facing an inexperienced opponent. They were facing a commander who had turned deception into a weapon, and an army that believed, for the first time, that it belonged on the battlefield. The battlefield was cleared slowly. Burned vehicles were pushed aside. Wounded men were evacuated in silence. The desert, which days earlier had echoed with engines and artillery, returned to its familiar stillness. But beneath that calm lay a shift that would echo far beyond North Africa. The German advance had failed. Not because of weather. Not because of supply shortages. And not because of luck. It failed because the enemy they faced was no longer predictable. In the days that followed, German command assessments began to change. Reports no longer described American units as inexperienced or easily broken. Instead, they emphasized coordination, speed, and aggressive exploitation. Analysts noted the effective use of deception, the integration of armor and artillery, and the relentless pressure applied even after the initial engagement. This mattered. German strategy relied on identifying weaknesses quickly and exploiting them decisively. That approach worked only when the enemy behaved according to expectation. What Patton demonstrated was that those expectations could be manipulated and turned into a liability. The impact was not limited to German headquarters. Among American troops, something fundamental had changed. Men who had doubted themselves weeks earlier now carried themselves differently. They had faced veteran panzer divisions, and not only survived, but forced them back. Confidence replaced fear. Initiative replaced hesitation. Patton understood the importance of this shift. He resisted the temptation to declare victory too loudly. There were no triumphal speeches, no exaggerated claims. Instead, he pushed his units forward, reinforcing the lesson that success came from movement, pressure, and momentum. Victory, he believed, was temporary. Confidence had to be maintained. Within Allied command, reactions were mixed. Some senior officers credited air power. Others emphasized logistics or numerical advantage. And many focused on the role of combined operations with British forces. All of these factors mattered. But none fully explained what had happened on that battlefield. Because armies with similar resources had failed before. What set this moment apart was leadership. Patton had not simply fought the Germans. He had fought their assumptions, about American weakness, about predictability, about psychological dominance. By feeding those assumptions and then breaking them at the moment of contact, he forced the enemy to question its own instincts. That doubt would linger. In later engagements, German commanders became more cautious when facing American units. Advances slowed. Reconnaissance increased. Opportunities were missed because leaders hesitated, uncertain whether what they saw was real or another trap. This was the true consequence of Patton's victory. Not territory gained. Not tanks destroyed. But time stolen. Every moment the enemy spent questioning its intelligence was a moment the Allies could exploit. Every delayed decision weakened the effectiveness of German doctrine, which depended on speed and certainty. Patton's reputation grew rapidly after the battle. To his men, he was the commander who demanded more, and proved it was possible. To Allied leaders, he became both an asset and a concern. His aggressiveness was undeniable. So was his ability to disrupt enemy plans. To the Germans, he became something else entirely. A problem. A commander who could not be read easily. One who moved faster than expected, struck harder than predicted, and refused to behave according to established patterns. The lessons of that battle followed Patton into Sicily, across France, and eventually into Germany itself. Deception, speed, psychological pressure, these became hallmarks of his campaigns. Not because they were flashy, but because they worked. Years later, German officers reflecting on the war would describe the moment they realized American forces were no longer learning, they were competing. That realization began here. This battle did not end the war. It did not destroy the German army. And it did not make Patton invincible. What it did was change the equation. From that point forward, the Americans were no longer a question mark. They were a force that had to be planned for, respected, and feared. And at the center of that transformation stood a commander who understood a simple truth of warfare. The most decisive battles are not fought with firepower alone, but with the ability to control what the enemy believes. That was Patton's real victory. And it would shape the war that followed.